At the very beginning of year 1957, a prominent chemist named Zalman Shapiro founded NUMEC, the Nuclear Materials and Equipment Corporation, in the Pittsburgh suburb of Apollo in Parks Township, Pennsylvania. Shapiro had made a name for himself in the scientific community while working for the Westinghouse-Bettis Atomic Power Laboratory in the nearby borough of West Mifflin, where he helped develop the Mark I nuclear reactor for the world's first operational nuclear-powered submarine, the Nautilus, which was commissioned in 1954. Shapiro was a professed Zionist, and NUMEC's seed funding was provided by David Lowenthal, another American Zionist who secretly fought for Israel during the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, alongside would-be Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion and Mossad Director Meir Amit. Indeed, most of NUMEC's board and funding network were composed of prominent members of the Zionist Organization of America. The ZOA is an American pro-Israel nonprofit that supports Israel's internationally condemned annexation of the West Bank, actively opposes a two-state solution in Palestine or the existence of a Palestinian state in the region altogether, and lobbies the American federal government for these policies. Interestingly, Israeli-affiliated interest groups like the ZOA are the only foreign agents not forced by the American government to register as such under the 1938 Foreign Agents Registration Act. In fact, the last president to force an appendage of the Israel lobby to register as a foreign agent was John Kennedy, who, together with his brother Bobby, the Attorney General, pressured the American Zionist Council into registering, stopping its monetary contributions to U.S. public officials. This inconvenience was skirted in January 1963 by the incorporation of the American Israel Public Affairs Committee by Isaiah Kennan, a Canadian-American Zionist and employee of the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who previously ran the lobbying division of the AZC. Kennedy's untimely death in the fall of '63 effectively marked the end of federal government efforts to register Israeli interests and lobbying groups as foreign agents. After its incorporation, NUMEC immediately began receiving federal government contracts to produce nuclear fuel for the Navy's newly manufactured fleet of nuclear-powered warships. In June of 1966, Shapiro founded another company, the Israel Isotopes and Radiation Enterprises Limited, or ISORAD, as a joint business venture with the Israeli government, allegedly to irradiate bacteria affecting produce to extend shelf life. Around this time, with a heavy water reactor purchased from France in the 1950s, Israel's first nuclear facility, known as the Shimon Peres Nuclear Research Center, or Dimona after the nearby city, finished construction in the Negev desert and came online. As the Cold War warmed, America invested heavily in its nuclear capability, and business was booming at NUMEC. All the while, regulations on the production and transportation of nuclear materials were lax, and the Atomic Energy Commission, the federal agency in charge of regulating the nuclear energy industry, did not even require security clearances for all the people transporting shipments to and from plants. By '66, the NUMEC plant had already developed a reputation within the AEC for questionable quality control and had paid over $1 million in fines for uranium losses. The AEC had repeatedly requested logs on the plant's stocks of enriched uranium, and Shapiro had repeatedly failed to provide them. In an all-too-typical bureaucratic effort to keep the matter internal and FBI investigators away, then AEC Chairman Glenn Seaborg wrote to the Joint Committee on Atomic Energy that he believed that theft of highly enriched uranium from NUMEC was unlikely. However, when the AEC investigated NUMEC in '66, they refused to take any formal statements or follow up on leads. According to Victor Galinsky, a former commissioner at the AEC's successor organization, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the AEC deliberately stifled the investigation to avoid controversy and internal scrutiny. The numbers don't lie. In the first decade of its operation, the NUMEC plant lost 269 kilograms or 593 pounds of highly enriched uranium. This put the plant's material unaccounted for, or MUF metric, at least 2%, 10 times higher than the industry average of 0.2%. Additionally, a 1980 FBI investigation yielded the testimony of a NUMEC employee who claimed that in 1965 he witnessed unidentified individuals loading what appeared to be highly enriched uranium-235 canisters onto a ship bound for Israel. Furthermore, NUMEC invited numerous Israeli nuclear weapons development officials to its plant in 1968 under the auspices of being electric generator specialists. One of these was Rafi Eitan, a Mossad officer, head of the sister Israeli intelligence agency known as the Bureau of Scientific Relations, and the self-admitted handler of Jonathan Pollard, the Jewish American arrested in 1985 for violations of the Espionage Act and sentenced in '87 to life in prison for providing classified American intelligence to Israel. Despite an incredulous Atomic Energy Commission, Director of Central Intelligence Richard Helms sent a letter, now declassified but heavily redacted, on April 2, 1968, to then U.S. Attorney General Ramsey Clark under President Lyndon Johnson, informing him of NUMEC's uranium discrepancies and imploring his office to force the FBI to initiate a discreet intelligence investigation of an all-source nature of Dr. Shapiro in order to establish the nature and extent of his relationship with the government of Israel. It is critical for us to establish whether or not the Israelis now have the capability of fabricating nuclear weapons which might be employed in the Near East. Furthermore, introduction by Israel of such weapons into their arsenal would undoubtedly affect the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which has been placed before the United Nations by the United States and the USSR. The FBI had begun its investigation into NUMEC 3 years prior to Helms's pleading letter to Clark, but, together with the AEC, had simply been unable to turn up anything incriminating on Shapiro or the plant. A FOIA-requested, recently declassified CIA memo for the record from 1972, likely written by John Hatton, former CIA station chief in Tel Aviv, sheds light on a strange series of events regarding the FBI and AEC's investigations. Quote, "It is interesting in this connection to quote from the AEC investigation when the AEC team requested NUMEC production control and process engineering records on the WANL and other contracts. All efforts in this direction were negated when it was learned that many of the requested records had been inadvertently destroyed by supervisory personnel during a cleanup campaign at the time of an employee strike. According to the same document, this was in addition to another destruction of records that occurred during the same strike when, quote, a fire occurred in the vault containing nuclear materials at NUMEC, which effectively destroyed records of the input and output of material," unquote. The FBI effectively halted their inquiries, despite pleas made to it by the CIA. Quote, "The FBI informed CIA that while they had developed information clearly pointing to Shapiro's pronounced pro-Israel sympathies and close contacts with Israeli officials, redacted, the FBI believed that further investigation would be unlikely to produce any facts leading to conviction and therefore were terminating their active investigation," unquote. The memo expresses the CIA's frustration with the FBI and AEC, specifically referencing 1969 AEC interviews of Shapiro, on which the agency had been left in the dark, saying, quote, "It should be noted that the AEC meeting with Shapiro was not coordinated with CIA, although the AEC was well aware of CIA's interest in the affair. CIA attempts to persuade the FBI to continue the investigation proved fruitless," unquote. The author of the memo makes his position clear. Quote, "With regard to the material itself, it could have been shipped in less than critical lots of, say, 20 pounds per lot. Lead-coated or nickel-plated, it would present no radiation hazard and could have easily gone by diplomatic pouch or Israeli merchant ship or even El Al Airlines. Transportation of diverted material to Israel would have been a simple matter," unquote. Shapiro resigned from NUMEC in June 1970. There are many reasons the FBI could have been unwilling to find the truth, not the least of which is the likely compromised nature of their director, J. Edgar Hoover. But they could have simply been unwilling to assist the AEC or concerned with other intelligence and law enforcement efforts at the time. Years later, in June 1978, investigators from the Department of Energy told, by then the former AEC chairman, Seaborg, that traces of the same government-owned material primarily delivered to NUMEC for processing had been picked up in Israel. By this time, Seaborg refused to be interviewed by the FBI investigators, and the investigation was effectively ended in 1980. There were, however, official visits to the Dimona reactor by the American government, ostensibly to get to the bottom of the strange connections. According to a Johnson administration memorandum, the president sent an inspection team to the Dimona reactor site in January 1965. The team spent 10 hours at the plant, but the time, quote, "did not permit as detailed a visit as desirable," unquote. While the team concluded that there was nothing overtly suggesting a nuclear weapons development program, the team states, quote, "We remain concerned that Israel may have succeeded in concealing a decision to develop nuclear weapons. The team findings must be weighed against the following facts. 1. Israel concealed the existence of the Dimona reactor from us for about 2 years. 2. Israeli officials did not allow adequate time for thorough inspection of the Dimona site and arranged no visits to sites of projected related facilities. 3. Israeli officials ruled questions about procurement of uranium from abroad, quote, outside the scope of the visit, unquote, and suggested taking them up through normal diplomatic channels. 4. Israel is acquiring missiles from France designed to accommodate either high explosive or nuclear warheads. 5. Public and private statements by Israeli officials suggest military planning that includes the use of nuclear weapons." Given these circumstances, we urge prompt approval of the request of the Acting Secretary to the President dated December 18, 1964, for authority to initiate negotiations with Israel to extend International Atomic Energy Agency safeguards to all Israeli nuclear facilities. While the U.S. only discovered the Dimona facility in 1960 and allegedly inspected it every year from 1965 to 1969, it is unclear what they found. Little is known about the follow-up inspections after 1965, because by 1969, U.S. scientists were so stymied by the Israelis during their inspections that they complained in writing. What is certain is that Israel developed nuclear weapons sometime in the mid to late 1960s. At the same time the Dimona reactor came online, at the same time highly enriched uranium was going missing in large quantities from NUMEC, at the same time Shapiro was being investigated for the anomalies, and at the same time the CIA was screaming at the top of its proverbial lungs about mysterious fires destroying inventory records and the need for further investigation. It is certain that Israel, despite not being a signatory to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, possesses nuclear weapons. According to Carl Duckett, the CIA's former Deputy Director for Science and Technology, in a report accidentally made public by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission in 1978, the agency informed President Johnson of Israel's possession of nuclear weapons in 1968, the same year as Helms's memo, whereupon the President instructed them not to tell anyone else, including the Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense. Also in 1978, the CIA disclosed an assessment from 4 years prior that stated Israel had already armed itself with nuclear weapons, partly with uranium it had obtained by clandestine means. According to the report, a 1976 briefing from Duckett to the Commission about the CIA's knowledge of illegal attempts to obtain nuclear weapons resulted in Dr. Edward A. Mason, then Commissioner, later VP of Standard Oil, proclaiming, "My God, I almost went to work with Sal Shapiro. I came close to working for him." This removes any doubt what the CIA believed about the origin of Israel's nuclear weapons. In 1986, a former employee at the Dimona reactor facility named Mordecai Benunu met a Colombian freelance journalist named Oscar Guerrero, who put him in touch with the London Sunday Times. Benunu provided photos of Israel's secret nuclear weapons to the Times, who published them after verifying their legitimacy with British nuclear experts. Guerrero, hoping to cash in on the story from two separate sources, also attempted to sell the story to the Sunday Mirror. The Mirror was owned by Robert Maxwell, father of Jeffrey Epstein cohort and convicted child sex trafficker Ghislaine Maxwell. According to Ari Ben-Menashe, an arms dealer and former Israeli spy, Robert Maxwell was a Mossad asset and reported Benunu's identity to Israeli intelligence. Shortly after their publication, an Israeli intelligence asset posing as a female tourist lured Benunu to an apartment in Rome, where he was immediately jumped by 3 Mossad agents, handcuffed, injected with a sedative, kidnapped, and brought to Israel. Upon arrival, he was convicted of espionage and treason in a secret trial, after which he spent over 11 years in solitary confinement, followed by another 7 years of incarceration. To this day, Benunu is banned from using the internet or mobile phones, leaving the country, or even approaching embassies or borders. There has never been a serious suspicion about the material ending up in non-Israeli hands. The only alternative explanation that has been offered to explain the missing NUMEC uranium involves the material somehow inadvertently ending up in the air and plumbing of the plant and on the clothes of the employees. It is true that there have been lawsuits from former employees and residents of Parks Township regarding cancers caused by pollution from NUMEC. While an initial series of lawsuits resulted in a settlement of more than $80 million for several hundred plaintiffs, subsequent lawsuits have been thrown out by the Supreme Court. In the first decade of NUMEC's operations, nearly 600 pounds of highly enriched uranium went missing from NUMEC. In the second decade, only 176 pounds went missing. While it is possible that NUMEC employees could have been rubbing radioactive uranium on their clothes and hosing it down the sinks of the facility, even total disregard for safety by the employees handling the materials on a daily basis does little to explain the fact that the material's unaccounted for percentage is 10 times higher than the industry average, or why the facility suddenly got its MUF percentage down to the industry average immediately after 1968. Given the almost comically unbelievable series of events surrounding NUMEC, it is difficult to accept that Shapiro was simply a poor businessman, unable or unwilling to rein in the wastefulness and disregard for safety at his facility, and that efficiency simply improved after and due to his resignation in 1970. Since the diagnoses leading to lawsuits are coming as late as 2010, it is more likely that two things are true at once. Handling nuclear material has risks, and stealing it without consequences is possible. If you steal it for Israel.